Hi everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog. And as you may remember, I've spoken a few times on my channel about how I started making music quite a long time ago before YouTube tutorials were really a thing, and that I didn't really have the school or resources to get the teaching that I needed to make good music at the time. And so what I thought might be helpful is if we look at some of my earliest tracks and critique them, giving advice based on what I know now. From doing a quick preparation for this video, I have at least 4 lessons that I want to teach my previous self. 3 of which are about mixdown and 1 of them is about musicality. The mixdown is important, but the musicality is also super important. So do stick around for that tip. Let's have a look at what I'm talking about. So I've got 3 tracks ready here. One is called Corleone, one is called Heat On, and one is called Instinct. And they were made in a phase where I was trying to transition a little bit from being a kind of an electro DJ to moving into techno DJing. So I was trying to understand a little bit what the core features were of techno, and I would say with medium success. But let me give you an atmosphere of these 3 tracks. And as you'll notice, all 3 of them are pretty problematic in various ways, and we'll address that now. Alright, so these 3 tracks, they sound very different in terms of mixdown and sound design, and all of them quite amateurish. But why do they sound so different if they were all 3 made by the same person? Well, you might say I lacked sound design skills, you're probably right. You might say I lacked mixdown skills, you're probably right, but there was an even more important problem present in all of this, and that was that I simply couldn't hear what I was doing. If you have a terrible, problematic monitoring situation, it's impossible to get better at this stuff because you simply can't hear the impact of all the various audio tools on what you're doing. And so what I'm really talking about is my speakers. What I had back then were really shitty computer game speakers, you know, like those really small, thin sounding, cheap ones. I was a poor student, that's all I could afford. And then I went from those, I upgraded to an amplifier with 2 bookshelf speakers. And those bookshelf speakers, they were sold to me as monitors on eBay, but they didn't really have any brand that I could recognize. And they cost me in total about 80 euros, which at the time for me was big bucks. You know, I was 20 years old or something. This was like a big deal for me. So I figured going from these small computer speakers to these pretty decent sized speakers, this bass on this stuff is going to be incredible. It's like nothing I've ever heard before, right? And so when I listened to those speakers, I literally didn't know any better. I couldn't identify the problems that they had. But what those speakers had was that they could not reproduce any frequencies below 150 hertz. Now, as you may or may not know, the bigger your speaker, usually the easier that it has reproducing all of the frequencies, especially the low frequencies, right? And the smaller your speaker, the more that it can only reproduce the mid-range of the frequencies. So for instance, a bad laptop speaker will only be able to reproduce the mid frequencies. I don't know, maybe let's say 200 to 2000 hertz or something like that, right? So it'll only be able to reproduce something around the mids. But once the woofer of your speaker gets bigger and bigger, it's able to reproduce lower and lower frequencies. And so you get an insight into how much low frequencies is in the signal that's passing through it. But I had basically no information below 150 hertz. And let me tell you, if you are trying to make club music, the frequencies below 150 hertz are very important. Not just like important, right? It's like basically impossible to do this without having insights below 150 hertz. Now, how would you know if you're having the same problem? Well, here's a little trick. Let's do it together. I'm going to open a MIDI track. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an operator on there, which is this. And the operator can output a fixed signal at a certain amount of hertz. And let's start here at 500 hertz. So hopefully you can hear this, because otherwise you probably can't even hear my voice if you can't hear 500 hertz. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to sweep down, and this thing is still going to output a signal at a consistent volume, but at some point you're going to hear the volume drop, and at some point it's going to disappear. And that's not because there's no sound in the signal, it's because your speakers cannot reproduce those frequencies. And this is a really important thing to realize is what are the limitations of your speakers. So what I'm going to do is sweep down and you just make a mental note at which point you can no longer hear this signal. And once we've done this, rewind the YouTube video and do it again on any other monitoring systems that you have. Do it on your headphones, do it on your speakers, etc. And make a little note of what frequency is the cutoff frequency for each one of these. So let's go. Should still be fine on most systems. Here it would disappear on my old speaker. It should be gone for almost everyone, but notice how there's still signal. The light is still green, there's still signal coming out. So there are frequencies passing through the signal chain, but at some point your monitoring system can no longer reproduce them, and that includes your ears. At some point your ears can't even pick up those kind of frequencies anymore. So it's enough to know that if you could hear all the way down to, let's say, 45 or 40 hertz, that is enough to definitely make reliable club music, more or less. And I like to think that a lot of consumer electronica nowadays is able to reproduce that. So most of you should be in a pretty good shape. But some of you will undoubtedly have noticed that it's not enough. And that means you have to figure out a way to get insight into those frequencies. I would say one of the fastest shortcuts is not to buy heavy speakers, but to buy some pretty decent studio monitors, because those should be able to go down pretty damn low. So that's advice number one to give to struggling beginning producers, is just make sure you can hear all the frequencies, because if you can't make good decisions, or you can't even learn about anything, okay? So get that sorted first. Now, the second tip that I did not realize I had a problem with at the time is that I did never clean up my low end. Some sounds, especially high sounds with a lot of distortion on them, also have a lot of low frequency content that's not musically interesting, that's not helping the track at all. And that low frequency noise, it's not musically attractive, not like a rumble would be or anything. And it just sits there and it competes with your kick drum, making the impact of your kick drum in the low frequencies really blurry and unpleasant. These frequencies eat up a lot of headroom, like as in they push the volume of your track up, and that means that the rest of the track can't be as loud at the end when it goes through the limiter at the end. So in terms of clarity in your low end and in terms of overall volume, you want to probably use a filter to cut out the low end on many elements a lot of the time. And now this is an advice that you see a lot. What's one of the first mixdown advices that you will read everywhere. And so take it with a grain of salt. Don't high pass everything to the point that everything becomes thin. No, just look on the spectrum analyzer to see if, for instance, your hi-hats and things like this, if they also have frequencies down at like 30 and 40 and 50 hertz. Because if so, those are not the interesting ones and you want to just high pass that. Getting into the habit of looking at the spectrum analyzer in Ableton is very helpful for this, and Ableton has very simple EQ tools for this. Reason also has good EQ tools for it, but it doesn't have a spectrum analyzer super handy that I had the habit of looking at the time. But inside of Reason, what you can do is, on the mixer, there's this button which is the high pass filter, and you can just turn that on and bring up the frequency to a certain amount where it starts to affect the signal and then back off a little bit. That tends to be the most safe strategy. Usually high passing somewhere between 50 or 100 or 200 hertz is plenty for most signals. It depends really on the source material. So use your ears, and the moment you start thinning out your sound, that means you've gone way too far. The goal here is just to clean up the low frequencies, not to thin out the sound, okay? Be aware of that. Once you do this consistently, then the low frequencies will only be the kick drum plus whatever you choose to play alongside the kick drum. Maybe some bass, maybe some rumble, maybe some low toms, whatever you think the groove of the track needs. But those frequencies are the low end groove. You don't just want the kind of brown noise from a hi-hat interfering in that. I once tried playing a track like this on a club system, and let me tell you, it was a disaster. Because on a club system, the subwoofers, the big speakers that reproduce those ultra low frequencies, they're very, very powerful. And so if you have a lot of badly designed sounds in those sub frequencies, you amplify those and you put them onto a dance floor. It is a very unpleasant experience for everyone involved, let me tell you. Now, another problem that these tracks have is that they're not bright enough. You see, our ears don't perceive all frequencies equally. We are sensitive to upper mid frequencies. Our ears have a sensitivity bias, which is described by curves often called the Fletcher-Munson curve, or the equal loudness contour. And it's just a representation that says that our ears are most sensitive to upper mid frequencies and less sensitive to low frequencies. And to understand the implications of this, you just have to understand the difference between white noise and pink noise. White noise plays all frequencies equally loud. If you look at white noise on a spectrum analyzer, it's perfectly flat or horizontal. Pink noise, on the other hand, is distributed differently, and it has more energy in the low frequencies and less energy in the high frequencies. The idea of pink noise is that we subjectively think that all the frequencies are equally loud based on our human hearing, not on what the meters tell us, but on our human hearing. We would say the low frequencies sound approximately as loud as the high frequencies. We would say that in pink noise, the low and the high end is balanced. In white noise, we would say that it's very hissy. If I had to simulate white noise for you, we would say tss, right? Because all the frequencies are flat, but we are biased to hear the upper mid frequencies. And so what's the lesson to learn from that? Well, most music and most audio signals in general are probably more natural if they follow the contour of pink noise roughly, very roughly. This is just a thinking tool, right? Not something to be accurately measured or something. You want your bass frequencies a little louder than your upper mid frequencies, but you want your upper mid frequencies to be pretty present. And achieving a good balance of low, mid, and high frequencies is called achieving a good tonal balance. And that's an art that you have to learn, and you have to get your ears primed to understand tonal balance. Now, in my tracks, I go too far even in the opposite direction. Not like white noise, where everything is flat. Not like pink noise, where the subs are a little bit exaggerated compared to the highs. No, it's more like brown noise, which is even further, where it's very dark, the subs are very exaggerated, and there's very little information in the high mids. So the entire tilt of my track is too much towards the sub frequencies and not enough towards the upper mid frequencies. So that even if you play this track at maximum volume, people are still going to say that it sounds quiet because it doesn't have a lot of high mid frequencies. So to compensate for that, let's do a very, very naive kind of mastering move. And I'll put on this equalizer, which is going to tame a little bit that low end, and then a limiter. There we go. And so now this track starts to feel like tonal balance is not so far away. And once we're at tonal balance, once we've achieved tonal balance, we can think a little bit further about, is the sound design of the elements good enough? Are they musically good enough, etc. But I'll show you before and after. So before, after. Super subby. I don't know if your system can show you that, but it's really subby and sounds quiet. Now it sounds a lot less subby, and the highs, the upper mids are a lot more present. Subby, terrible mix down. Not an amazing mix down, but a lot less problematic. A very similar problem occurs in Hedon as well. Let me play you that for reference. So many sub-frequencies. So now let's turn this on. Still really blurry in the low mids. But it starts to get a little bit better like this. So before, it's just like brown noise. Now the curve's a bit more like pink noise. And so from here you can start sound designing. And from here, if you want to check what tonal balance would sound like, you would A/B with a reference track. Watch this video where I go into depth about how and why to reference, but in very, very brief summary, you need to put a reference track in Ableton and solo it and make sure that it's at the same RMS volume as your signal, and that way you can check if your tonal balance is similar to the reference track's tonal balance. Some people will tell you, by the way, not to measure in RMS, but to measure in LUFS instead. And while they're not wrong, think about it like this. LUFS is really very similar to RMS, but it's like RMS multiplied with these equal loudness contours. It's weighted towards the upper mid frequencies so that when two tracks have a similar LUFS, they sound approximately as loud in those upper mid frequencies. So if you're like me, and especially for beginners, I invite you first to get comfortable listening to two different tracks, so your track and a reference track, at the same RMS, and then listen to the difference in tonal balance. Does yours have too much subs, not enough subs? Kind of enough mids or not enough mids? Too much highs, not enough highs? Compared to a tonally balanced reference track. Because this way you'll start to get a sense for what's too bright, what's too dark, what's too blurry, what's well defined. These kind of things. If your monitoring system, if your speakers aren't super bad, you should be able to tell the difference between your track and their track, and that's going to teach you where the problems arise in your compositions. So we've had 3 lessons so far. Work on speakers where you can actually hear all the frequencies. Clear out unwanted frequencies in your low end so that your kick is not drowned out in a sea of low end garbage. And 3, achieve tonal balance by following roughly the contour of pink noise on a spectrum analyzer. Now, the 4th and possibly most important lesson that was maybe the hardest to learn because it took me a long time to internalize it was understanding the global groove of the track. And what is groove? Well, it's sometimes hard to express because it's kind of an intuition that musicians build up over time. It's sometimes hard to verbalize what the point really is here. But let me try my best to explain my understanding of it. So let's say that groove is the difference and the feeling between the emphasized beats and the de-emphasized beats in the rhythm of your track. So we're not talking about notes, we're not talking about pitches or anything, we're talking about timing and emphasis. And groove is something that you can sing usually, all right? And so use your mouth, your voice, no matter how silly you think it feels, to sing the groove. So for example, a lot of techno tracks would go ba-da-da-da, 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 or boom-tsa, 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 or ba-da-da-da, 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 ba-da-da-da. You see what I'm doing here? I'm making a bit of silly sounds, but I'm trying to mark the difference between accented moments and non-accented moments in short rhythmical loops. And so a track that has a good and clear groove is easy to dance to. And I'd say that you can look at groove in at least 2 ways. One is the global groove of the track, how all the elements groove together. And the other one is, for instance, just in the low end to see how the low end elements groove together. And if the global groove and the low end groove are harmonious, if they work well together or they are even the same, then the groove and the danceability of your track is going to be very clear, and that's going to be very pleasant to listen to for your audience. And the chances of that working on a dance floor are much higher. So for example, the track here that has a very bad groove is Instinct. All right, I'll hit play. If you had to sing the groove of this track, it would be ba-da-da, 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 ba-da-da. That's not a very danceable groove. That's not very pleasant at all. And the groove is accented by this bass sound. Do-do-do, 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 do-do-do. And in techno tracks, the groove should probably more be carried by the percussion. So at least the kick drum should be up way louder in volume compared to the bass. And so the kick drum should be setting the downbeat. It should be going boom, 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 boom. And then other elements can sit next to that and complete that groove. So you could go ba-da-doom, ba-da-doom. But here it's the bass is prominent and it goes na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na, and the kick is just kind of lower than the bass in priority simply due to volume at least. That's the first culprit, right? So in general, relative volume of elements is your number one tool to make the rhythmical story coherent. And the main tool that you have to sanity check all this is your voice. Just sing it. If it goes do-do-do, 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 and you know not a single other techno track that the groove goes like that, probably a bad idea. What also doesn't help is that the groove in the low end, this do-do-do, is not reflected at any other level of the mixdown. At the top end, it's just a kind of a shuffly house pattern with a way too loud clap. Also, if you look in the low end, imagine we put a filter on there and we listen only to the low end. Look at this. You see this? This is a low end that never stops. The bass is just continually playing these notes, and it's not leaving any space in the low end for the kick to hit. So for the kick drum in the low end to mean something, there has to be a little bit of silence before it. So it's a badly designed low end. The groove is not reflected at any other level of the production. It wasn't a very danceable groove to begin with. And this is a terrible basis to begin building a track on. No matter how interesting the other sounds around this are trying to be, and they're not anyway, the groove of the percussion, the core percussion, the kick and the other low elements and the hi-hats, the way they play together is not solid. And then if it's not solid, don't continue your techno track because it's just not going to work. Choose a kick drum that sounds great, prioritize it in the mix, make sure that other elements are played at a volume so that they make the kick still seem massive at the end in the mixdown, and play them in a groove so that the kick maintains its priority and its importance in the global groove of the track. Re-listening to these tracks, I feel kind of touched because I think that back in the day I had a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of maybe medium to good ideas, but the absolute lack of technical skills sadly just undermined any chance of any of those being articulated in a way that anyone was going to like them. All three of these were definitely also made in Reason, and Reason is an amazing plugin suite, but if you're producing only with Reason, do make sure that you have some strong analysis tools within Reason, like a spectrum analyzer, and that you understand how gain staging works, because developing those skills is essential to getting pro-level productions within Reason or any DAW actually. I hope this analysis was of some help to you and that some beginner producers can avoid making some of the same mistakes that I did. If you are a beginner and you want to learn in a more structured context how to do all this, I made a course called The Foundations of Electronic Music, which is not just techno, but kind of all electronic music genres altogether. You learn the basis of mixdown and how to understand basic frequencies and volume balancing and all these kind of things in there. If you want to see what kind of techno I make with this nowadays, check out Torque on SoundCloud and Spotify. Like the video if you found this helpful, subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell icon. Come say hi on our Discord channel. And until next time, stay producing, be good to one another, and take care. Bye bye.